Hello, I'm Cormac. You're listening to Queerly Beloved, supported by Amazon Music. In this series, I invite DJs and musicians, friends and allies from the LGBTQ+ community to talk about music, queerness, and anything else that shapes their unique story. It is my hope that in sharing our individual experiences, we can learn and grow and focus on our similarities rather than our differences. You can find all of the music mentioned in today's episode and each episode at the link in the episode description. This is a special episode where myself and my producer, Michael Lane, hello Michael.
Hello Cormac.
We'll discuss a few people, a few places, a few themes that have been recurrent in season 1 of Queerly Beloved.
Shall we get started?
Let's. Someone of note that has popped up on various episodes would be Boy George. It's kind of impossible in, the last century to mention queer culture and not mention Boy George.
Mm-hmm.
I often assume that our listeners know mostly who Boy George is and what Boy George has contributed to music culture, but that may not be the case. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to delve a little bit into the world of George O'Dowd.
So the music of Boy George, what would you go to if you were to look him up?
I think the first go-to point for Boy George is definitely Culture Club.
Right.
Culture Club sold more than 50 million records worldwide in the 80s. And Boy George became a talking point in most UK, American, and I guess the world households, primarily because of how he looked and also because of how he sounded. Aside from the aesthetics, they made deservedly chart-topping music, which crossed various cultures. The name Culture Club was derived from the diversity within the band, George being a rather gender non-conforming white Irish man, and also his bandmates, one of Jamaican descent, another of English white soul boy. So collectively, they were a culture club, hence the name.
If I were to think of Culture Club, it would be Karma Chameleon.
So hits include Karma Chameleon, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, Time, Church of the Poisoned Mind. Yeah, those are kind of some of the bigger hits, I guess. I would say that although I was fond of Culture Club, my love affair with Boy George's music began after he left Culture Club. And in the 90s, he formed a collective called Jesus Loves You. In his early days in Culture Club, he was often playing with the idea of spirituality and religion. He often wore these smock outfits. I think they were designed by Sue Clowes, and they had Hebrew writing on them. And when he left Culture Club, he continued with this slightly more religious aesthetic combined with music. We do talk on Queerly Beloved about the parallels and the connections between the transcendence of spirituality and the transcendence of music. So I think it's worth mentioning that with George. He also had a record label called More Protein with a very famous track with MC Kinky called Everything Starts with an E. It's quite a famous Acid House track. I think that's very much worth checking out. And some solo stuff. One of my favorite songs ever written is called If I Could Fly by Boy George. And another song which he wrote about his friend dying from AIDS is called Il Adore. And it's an incredible piece of work as well. So I would recommend to the listener to go and check those out.
What was it like when Culture Club were big, kind of early, mid-80s?
Well, I was at primary school, so
Okay.
I was a kid. And,
Right.
at the time, the big discussion in my peer group was, did you see that on TV last night? Is that a man or a woman? So I kind of avoided Boy George. Although I loved the music, it was too close to the oven for me. It was too hot. I already was getting heat for being too feminine, for being too queer, for being too much of a poof. So I wasn't going to fess up and say that I loved Boy George because it would have been a bit of a confirmation, I guess. So I was equally enthralled and a little bit afraid of Boy George somehow. It was too close for comfort. You have to think at the time, Culture Club ruled the charts in the same way that Madonna did, in the same way Michael Jackson did. And the phenomenon of them was really quite astounding, really, in the way that queer kids today have drag queens in the living room due to Drag Race. I guess Boy George, in a way, did the same service in the 80s because whether people loved him or disliked him, they had this very gender non-conforming person on TV. George wore lots of makeup, had long hair in plaits, in ribbons, in bows. You probably know how he looked if you think of Boy George, but certainly a Google search will show you how fantastical Boy George looked. And also I think Lady Gaga has taken a lot of inspiration from Boy George in that there have definitely been a decade of Lady Gaga's career where her looks were so paramount and changing so radically that she had many different personas in very short periods of time. And Boy George, I would say, was the leader of that idea.
You mentioned in a couple of episodes that he was kind of completely accepted. You mentioned a couple of times the grannies liked him.
I think that's a fair point. He was very non threatening in a way, partly because his look was so feminine and the character of George is very charming. There's a charm to him. And also, let's not forget his voice. He has this incredible, soulful voice, which at times, has been compared to Smokey Robinson, for example. So there was a charm, a talent, a charisma, and a softness there. At the time within the 80s, well, within homophobia, there were various depictions of queerness and especially of gay men. And very often of gay male culture, it was hypersexual, similar to now, where there is a narrative pushed by more conservative and right wing press of trans people being a threat to your kids. There was also this narrative in the 80s of gay men being a threat to your children, of homosexuality being a threat to your children. It's still there today, but it was very prominent within the 80s. Boy George didn't look like that. Teenage girls dressed like him. And also, some of the things he was saying, a lot of the queer icons of that time that we acknowledge now weren't necessarily out. Freddie Mercury wasn't massively out. Elton John wasn't massively out. Boy George didn't come out until later. And when they would confront him about his sexuality, he very famously said, "I'd rather have a cup of tea," which, at the time was very disarming. And it invited people in to love him, even if they had been brainwashed into disliking gay people. So he was a very powerful force in that way, I think just by being himself. Alongside that, there was a lot of vitriol towards Boy George, and George, like many young people who are, thrown into the midst of fame, turned to coping mechanisms. And as we know with queer people, the rates of addiction are higher. And George had quite a famous drug problem in the 80s. And the homophobia attached to the witch hunt on George was horrendous. They were writing horrific things about him having days to live, about him being HIV positive, dying of AIDS, which he wasn't. So the pleasure that seemed to be taken by particularly the Sun newspaper and more conservative right-wing UK newspapers in tearing George down was pretty horrific, I must say. His battles with addiction continued on and off until the early noughties. But in recent years, it's been amazing to watch the phoenix of Boy George rise again. He's been a guest judge on The Voice, and is probably in America as big a star as he ever was. He's really turned things around. I really recommend to the listener to read Take It Like a Man, which already will tell you that Boy George has a great sense of humor, but that's the name of his first autobiography. And it's an incredible book to read. A lot of my non queer friends have read it and absolutely love it. And I constantly have a copy of it in my flat wherever I am. So I recommend that book to any ally that wants to have more understanding of what it was to grow up in Thatcherite Britain and what it was to be famous in the 80s and what it was to be Boy George. And to any queer person, I think it's a very important book for us to read.
So the second person that we wanted to talk about is Grace Jones.
I'm really happy to talk about Grace Jones. I'm a huge fan. She is Jamaican born. She moved to New York in her teens. She was a successful model in New York and I believe in Paris also. She famously lived with Jerry Hall, and I can just imagine the escapades those two got up to living together. Grace is remarkable because, similar to George, she very much seems to dance to the beat of her own drum. She also faced the ire of the press, and it's very interesting to note the narratives around Grace Jones versus, per se, the narratives around Boy George. You could see very clearly that to be a feminine looking man, as George was, eventually brought a lot of slander and critique around being weaker, having disease, the negative stuff that often comes with homophobia. Whereas one of the narratives I remember that was very strong around Grace Jones, in that she was quite masculine presenting, was that she was an angry woman. And that's very interesting, I think, because it tells us a lot about the attributes that we attach to gender. And a woman finding her power is seen as angry, and a man finding his femininity is somehow seen as disempowering and weak.
This was mentioned in one of the episodes. The idea that you fear the femininity and you hate the femininity in people through some sense of innate misogyny. So if you see femininity in anybody, whether they're male, female, or gender non-conforming, then you hate that femininity.
But I think it's also saying, if you're afraid of how a gay man looks at you,
Mm-hmm.
it says something about how you look at women, because you're maybe not looking in admiration, but you're looking with the idea of conquering, or the idea of them submitting, and you're afraid that someone's looking at you in the same way.
Right. So what would be your go-to Grace Jones tracks?
Yeah, so I think the most known tracks are things like Pull Up to the Bumper, Private Life, La Vie en Rose are a few of the most known. Slave to the Rhythm is an incredible piece of music, and I really recommend listening to that. My favorite Grace Jones track is a track called Unlimited Capacity for Love. Grace has always embraced this very soulful R&B, Sly and Robbie sound, but she was also had a moment as a disco singer, and you can still hear that in her music somehow.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned when talking about Boy George the religious element to it, because Grace Jones once described her childhood as having been crushed underneath the Bible.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think within all of the people that we're talking about today, there is this kind of connection to religiosity. And I don't know if that comes, if that's just by chance, if that's also maybe the people I connect to through my own history of growing up in a religious background, or if there just is this connection between queer transcendence and religious spiritual transcendence somehow. I'm not really sure.
Yeah,
It's a fascinating thing to think that, those things are maybe morally or socially in opposition, but actually they're probably just rooms in the same house somehow.
What do you remember about Grace Jones from when you were, a kid experiencing her music or her image for the first time?
I loved her. I certainly wasn't afraid of her,
Mm.
and I really loved her. I felt connected to her. I loved seeing her on TV. There's quite a famous interview where she attacks the. This might have also contributed to the idea that she was angry, but there is quite a famous TV interview where she's being asked very stupid questions by an English presenter. I think he's called Russell Harty.
Russell Harty.
And
Yeah.
yeah, she slaps him. She's not having it. And I remember that being quite a thing on TV at the time. And I also remember understanding that the questions she was being asked were very stupid. I really recommend reading Grace's autobiography. It's called I'll Never Write My Memoirs. And I love that book. There's a fantasy element to it, I think, but it's a beautiful read. And I remember the first time I read it, I thought this is a great kind of guide to thinking outside the box, because that's something also to be said about Grace Jones. I mean, I mentioned that she, dances to the beat of her own drum. So it wasn't just that she looked different and that she sounded different, but she lived differently and she thinks differently, and you can really see that and read that within her book. There was also a recent, well, kind of recent in Grace Jones' history, because she's famously slow in her output, but Bloodlight and Bami is a fascinating documentary. I've seen it 3 times when it came out, which I think is probably one of the few pieces of film I've ever seen 3 times. And it's a documentary covering the production of her last album called Hurricane. But it's also an insight into her family life and her life in Jamaica. And you get a good glimpse of where she's from and the religious upbringing that she's had. And it's very funny to watch and very beautiful. And I recommend it highly.
Moving on from people to a place.
Aha. Well, I will mention the club Trade Club. It's mentioned a fair bit in series one, and it was a seminal and I would say queer culturally important after hours nightclub. It was formed in 1990 by a man called Lawrence Malice.
Great name.
Yeah, Lawrence is quite the character. It took place at a very crazy venue in London known as Turnmills. Turnmills was a Gaudi inspired venue. So, Gaudi, the architect. So, it was very crazy looking, lots of spirals and kind of almost like Hieronymus Bosch inspired aesthetic. And that aesthetic and the colors in the club very much added to the mayhem and the hyperdrive and the ecstaticness of what was trade.
Where does the name trade come from?
So, trade actually comes from the Polari word trade, which would refer to guys that you're picking up.
Okay.
Very often in London at the time, once the club's closed, you might go cruising in a park and pick up some trade. So Lawrence called the club trade as an alternative, or at least a reference to that practice. And I think he was thinking, going to the club's a bit safer also. So yeah, it was a great choice of name, and it really stuck.
And for anyone who's listening to this and actually doesn't know what Polari is, you're not referring to the record label Polari. You're referring to something else.
Yeah, so Polari was a subculture queer language which debatedly was formed in the 19th, some say the 16th century. And it's kind of slang. Initially, it was used by actors and sex workers and Navy sailors and criminals. And it became very popular in gay subculture. So it was kind of used by, the misfits in society. And it was a way to communicate with your comrades and not get arrested, basically, for whatever you were up to.
And you picked it as the name for your record label.
I did pick it as a name for the label, yeah, because I think it's an under-celebrated, quirky part of queer history, and I like the idea of it bringing people together. And I think language has the power to do that, similar to how music has the power to do that. So for me, it felt like a fitting name for the record label.
Amazing. So back to Trade. What kind of DJs were playing at Trade?
So Trade had a bigger room and a smaller room. And the bigger room was playing a harder techno and a harder house sound, which was very popular in the 90s. Often on Series 1, I talk about the zeitgeist that moves around in clubs. You know, New York has had really seminal, important clubs, and London has had very important, seminal clubs, and Paris has had very important club. And, you know, now Berlin has very leading, important sounding clubs. And at the time, that zeitgeist, I believe, in part, was a trade in London. It was a tougher sound. DJs such as Tony DeVee were playing there, Fat Tony, who's still DJing today, Smoking Joe, Mrs. Wood was playing there, EJ DeBell was playing there. Some of these names you won't know, but they were very seminal, influential DJ names in the 90s. The music was fast, intense, lots of vocals, very sweaty and very hyper real. Walking into Trade was like walking into a parallel universe. My first visit to Trade was such an eye opener. It was the 90s. It was the first time I saw people with crazy colored hair, with facial piercings, with huge muscles. It was the first time I saw people who I wasn't sure what their gender was, where I saw very openly transsexual people enjoying themselves, where you might have seen the odd celebrity. It was a fascinating circus subculture experience.
Can you remember who was playing the first time you went there?
Actually, I remember the very first time I went, Blue Peter was DJing and he was playing a harder house techno sound. And I also remember listening to Tony DeVee, who's also a very important character within that time. He was an exemplary DJ of techno and harder house scene. He was a resident of Trade and he was massively influential worldwide. There's a recent documentary which is it's not released to the public yet, although I have seen it, about Tony DeVee and about his protege Fergie, who's also from Northern Ireland. And once it comes out, I recommend watching it. It's called
Don't ever stop.
It's called Don't Ever Stop. Also, I have incredible memories of finding my way from the bigger room into the smaller room at Trade. I wasn't so much into the soulful house thing initially. I was much more into the harder techno thing, which was more familiar to where I was coming from in Northern Ireland. But I eventually found my way through my love of people into my love of a softer sounding, more vocal house sound, which was happening in what was known as the Light Lounge. And that was the first time that I encountered Fat Tony, for example, who was a guest on Series 1.
What was your experience meeting Tony for the first time?
Well, I wouldn't really meet Tony. Tony was notorious. Everyone talked about Tony. Was he coming to the club? Was he dead? How many drugs has he done? You know, he was kind of infamous. So I would watch Tony DJing and I wasn't afraid of him. I would go to the booth and watch him. And I think we did speak a few times. One of my early memories of Tony was him playing a Janet Jackson record alongside quite fast house music. And he couldn't quite get the slower BPM Janet Jackson record to match the tempo of the faster record. And so he was using his finger. And I remember watching him do that. But the effect in the club was insane because although that shouldn't work, it was absolute mayhem. People were going crazy. And it was like Janet Jackson was involved in that hyper craziness of Trade. Like her voice was all over the place because of him speeding up the record. And it was so good.
Fuck yeah.
And I learned a lot about DJing at Trade just from watching DJs and listening. I learned to take chances to, you know, I think as a DJ, it's more important sometimes to take chances and maybe have them not work than it is to not take chances. And I learned that at trade, I think, from listening to DJs. I remember Tony's another example where he just stopped the record and put on Elton John, Your Song. And again, that shouldn't work. And the whole place, it totally went off. And I think that is a mixture of reading the room and following your gut.
What was the door policy like on clubs like this back then, on places like Trade? Because now, if you're going out to scenes that kind of try and keep and curate the crowd that comes in, there has to be quite a harsh door policy.
Mm.
Was it just because it wasn't known outside the scene that you'd kind of get this kind of crowd there? Was it because they were asking questions on the door? What's that like?
In retrospect, I know a little bit more about that than I did at the time. You know, I was in London. I was working in clubs. I was either doing the cloakroom or doing the bar or handing out flyers. So, you know, I knew the people who maybe were handing out the flyers for trade. So when I went to the door, I always had quite an easy time. I remember the guy who did the door was called Lee. So I would kind of find my way in somehow. But looking back on it, it was a tough door policy from what I know. Because it gained popularity, there were celebrities who wanted to come who maybe expected some special treatment and they wouldn't get in, for example. Or also, as it gained popularity, there would be more and more people who were maybe not fundamental or such a part of the scene. Maybe they weren't queer or, you know, they wanted to come in a more touristic way. And Lee, from what I know, was quite a fierce door queen and you had to make it past him. So if you couldn't make it past him, you wouldn't get in. There was always this queue of muscle boys that you had to walk through. It was known as Muscle Mary Alley. And it was kind of terrifying, you know, because I was this skinny, punky Irish boy with blue hair. And there was a certain aesthetic between these muscle gays. And it was really a response, I guess, to HIV and to AIDS, of this hyper fitness, hyper health of looking as healthy as you possibly could. There were a lot of steroids involved. And anything that didn't look like that just didn't get featured. So sometimes walking through that was a bit terrifying.
I can imagine.
The other thing to mention about trade were the toilets. They were very colorful, and when you would go to the toilet, regardless of what heightened state you were in, the toilets were quite a trip. But if you were in a heightened state, it could take you maybe 2 hours to get in and out of the toilets because they were such a trip. And there weren't very many toilets for the size of the venue. So it was a big exploration to take a trip to the toilet. And the other thing was that because of clubbing culture and drug culture not being as widely known or as widely policed, perhaps at that time, the first time I went into trade, there were two huge queues down the stairs. And one of them was leading to one man who was selling ecstasy, and the other was leading to another man who was selling acid and speed. So you had to join the queue that you wanted to go. But it was like, it was blatant and obvious and crazy.
So, if there's one track, and I'm going to define a rule here, which is that you can't mention the Elton John track or the Janet Jackson track, what would be one track that you would associate with Trade?
It's a shame. Well, I have mentioned those two tracks because those are very personal memories for me. I think there is a track, it's from like 92. It's from NRG, and the track is called He Never Lost His Hardcore.
Okay.
I've never found a moment to play it out. You know, sometimes these tracks that had a massive impact on you, there's a thin line between them being very personal and them being publicly powerful. I have had tracks which feel very personal to me, but when I've played them out, it just doesn't translate. And then I've also had tracks that are just as personal to me, and I've taken a chance and they've totally worked. I've never had the moment to play this. And it may come, it may not, but I recommend going and listening to it. It's by NRG, that's the letter NRG, and it's called He Never Lost His Hardcore. But I think you should also, if I may say, go and listen to a track, a Tony DeVitt track called The Dawn. And I believe it's one of the later tracks that he made. And from what I know, at this time, he knew he was HIV positive. and he wanted to make a track which was still uplifting and reminded people of the positive. And I find that very beautiful, and it's still a beautiful track.
So if you're looking back on this and now from the perspective of 20 years later, what's the legacy of trade now?
Certainly, trade is not the first example where gay clubbing or queer clubbing music culture is the pinnacle of nightlife. When we look at clubbing culture right now, queer clubs, again, seem to be at the pinnacle. You know, they're leading the way in some regard. And trade was that for the 90s, I would say. And also, you know, it's worth mentioning that trade continues because Lawrence, who owns trade, now owns a club in London called Egg Club, which some of our listeners may know. And trade do have reunions there, and there's a resurgence of that sound. You know, the music that was played by Tony DeVitt is now getting played by Charlotte DeVitt. And, you know, this harder house, trancy, uplifting, age of love music is being played again. Documentaries are being made about trade. There are some good online references to learn more about the club. Mixmag did a great review and exploration of trade in 2022. And so did DJ Mag, because I guess that was an anniversary. Maybe that was 30 years of trade. So I think it's worth going and Googling trade DJ Mag and trade Mix Mag to find out some more information. Something that I didn't mention about trade, the artwork was incredible. Super pop culture, Warholian from an artist called Trademark.
Did you ever keep any of them?
I do have some trade flyers, and I have the ticket from the very last ever trade. I have it here. And I did try to get a piece of the dance floor before they tore the building down, but I was unsuccessful.
Let's move on to talk about our last featured person, who is Sylvester.
Well, Sylvester comes up time and time again on the podcast, and rightly so. Sylvester is a monumental voice within disco and soul. If you know some disco and high energy tracks from the 70s and 80s, you will undoubtedly know Sylvester's high, flamboyant, falsetto voice.
What would be your go-tos for Sylvester?
I would say probably his biggest hit is Mighty Real.
Mm-hmm.
You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, followed by Do You Wanna Funk and Menergy. I also love some stuff from his I think it was his last album. No, it was his second last album. There's a track on it called Sex, which I still play very often. And Dance is always a great track. And Stars is a great track. Some of those are lesser known. So I guess the bigger ones would be like Do You Want to Funk, Mighty Real, Menergy.
The Ian Levine or Levine remix of Sex is one which, like,
Yeah.
it just screams sweaty boys in a bunker.
Well, and so does Menergy, you know, because Menergy is talking about menergy, but it's really talking about dance floors next to dark rooms and that atmosphere and that chemistry and that synergy and that electricity that happens in such spaces.
So what was it about Sylvester, you think, that struck such a chord with so many of our guests and with you and so many, millions of people?
Well, let's remember that the origins of house and techno, let's focus on house music first, comes from queer black culture. Sylvester was a rising star from a culture of minority, oppressed, often rejected people. So, that in and of itself is an amazing accolade and an amazing thing to celebrate. Aside from that, Sylvester had an incredible voice. They also grew up in religion. They had an evangelical background, but they were rejected by the church quite early on because of their queerness. And they found their family then within a group of black transsexual singers known as the Discotays. And again, we kind of touch on this thing, Michael, between the transcendence of gospel, of evangelical gospel, and evangelical transcendence on dance floors.
There was something in Sylvester's voice.
Mm.
How was it that Lakuti put it? She said, "What is that?" She couldn't tell who it was that was singing.
Mm.
And it's this gender bending quality of falsetto, which is so rich and has so much in there and has so much power behind it. What impact did that have on you when you heard it for the first time?
When I heard disco, it was like a hymn.
Mhm.
You know, as I said, I grew up in quite a religious household and I was familiar with hymns. When I heard disco, it was like a big gay hymn, although I didn't have the word gay at the time. But it felt like my music. It felt like I knew how to move to it immediately.
Yeah.
I knew how to sing along to it. I knew it. It was just waiting for me to hear it. It made so much sense to me, disco. And especially when disco became more electronic, when it moved into high energy stuff. I mean, I still play a lot of that.
Wow.
And that's a sound very dear to my heart. And I think it's a very authentic sound for me to play. But I mean, it just makes so much sense to me. In the same way, Michael, you know, there's this stereotype that The Wizard of Oz is like a super gay movie. And before I knew anything about that, it was my favorite movie as a kid.
Mhm.
And Sylvester, Grace Jones, Boy George, they just made sense to me. There was a knowing there, you know? And I think probably it's because they are gender defying on some level from what we learn. You know, you talk about the transcendence of the voice, and there is a non-specific gender to it, so there's a freedom in that, you know. And not just if you're queer. I think there's a freedom for that in everyone, of letting go of as little or as much conditioning as you want to in that moment, for everyone.
There's actually a quote from Sylvester, just bringing it. You're talking about gender expression, but
Mm.
this is about sexuality, which, as we know, are two separate things. But
Hmm.
there's a quote which is, "My sexuality has nothing to do with my music. When I'm fucking, I'm not thinking about singing, and vice versa." And it seems to kind of chime with what you're saying, which is that when you're in a club experiencing this with people or listening on your own, it has nothing really to do with your sexuality, your gender expression, but also everything to do with that.
Well, it has everything to do with it because there's no escaping it.
Yeah.
You know, if you're different, and especially if you're different when it comes to gender presentation or sexuality, or if your difference is highlighted, and especially if it's highlighted in a negative way, you don't really have much choice. It's like if you try and assimilate, that doesn't work either, you know, for many people. So there is a defiance that comes with that because just by being yourself, it becomes a political act. Walking down the street wearing what you want becomes a political act. Sylvester talking how he wanted, singing how he sang, looking as he looked, there's no day off. And it's not an act, it's who they are. And I would say the same for Boy George, the same for Grace Jones. So maybe from a more conservative viewpoint, that might look like an act of defiance, but I think it's an act of survival because if you don't get behind it and support yourself, what are you going to do?
Mm. If our listeners want to learn a bit more about Sylvester, what would be your go-to things to look at?
I would suggest checking out Love Me Like You Should, The Brave and Bold Sylvester. It's on Amazon Music YouTube channel. Definitely
Okay,
worth a watch. And also, there's quite a renowned book called The Fabulous Sylvester by Joshua Gamzon. It's worth checking out.
amazing.
If you're researching Sylvester, there's a little bit of a sideline to investigate the Coquettes. And they were an avant garde, psychedelic, cross dressing, somewhat hippie troupe of soul singers and performers that were knocking around San Francisco in the 70s. And Sylvester was part of the Coquettes for a moment, but then left to do a solo thing. But if you come across a documentary called The Fabulous Coquettes, please do go check it out.
So, Cormac, I guess we will see everybody next season.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Until the next episode, I wish you well.
Bye.
You've been listening to Queerly Beloved with me, Cormac. You can find the playlist of all the music featured in today's episode in the episode description. And while you're there, please do hit subscribe so you don't miss out on my conversations with other talented people. A big thank you to Michael Lane, my producer, my manager, Melissa Taylor at Tailored Communication, and of course to Amazon Music for their support. Take care of yourself. All the best. Bye.